Greetings, friends. I'd like to welcome you to the third chapter of the Grand Design Exposed, which is titled Rome, Implacable Enemy of God's Truth, Reason for Reformers' Cries. Now, this chapter is going to be a little different than how I did the former chapters, because some of these sections are relatively short, but this chapter is also a short chapter, so probably in the next video, this video is only going to be doing one section, but probably in the next video I'm probably going to be doing sections 2, 3, and 4, and 5, all in one video. So it will kind of be like section 2 as far as video format, because the next 4 sections are really short, and they just basically scratch the surface to make it easier, easy for you, the listener, or those that are following along, the reader, understand what's going on here. Because what we're going to get into, it can go so in depth, and if we're not careful, we can actually go too in depth with it, that it could actually lead us away from the truth of Scripture. Okay, because we could be so focused on the occult and the esoteric aspects of Rome, and these types of things. So, but what this chapter is basically kind of like how chapter 1 was, because we just went over an intense chapter about the Knights Templars. So this chapter is kind of like more of a dialing down of a simple research and simple study prior to really getting involved with the Reformation, which starts with Martin Luther in chapter 4. So, and chapter 3 is only, it's only 12 pages. So, this chapter is going to go relatively quick. So we should be done with this chapter, and probably starting chapter 4 by the middle, if not near the end of this week. So we're going to go ahead and get started in section 1, which is called Pagan Rome, out of chapter 3, which is called Rome, Implacable Enemy of God's Truth, Reason for Reformers' Cries. Rome, from its earliest history, has always been the implacable enemy of God's truth. From its decree to crucify Jesus Christ to sending early Christians to their deaths in a Colosseum arena of ravenous lions, it was that same sun worship system of religion that had been originally concocted in Babylon. Anciently, it had come to Rome in fragments and was known historically as Pagan Rome. But later, as the imperial Roman Empire collapsed and papal Rome took its place, Babylonian sun worship manifested itself in an almost pure and radical form. And even though today it has lost the power to have one executed for not conforming to its doctrines, it is still the same and is called the Roman Catholic Universal Church. I want to interject here and basically state that really technically it did not lose its power to have one executed for not conforming to its doctrines. It still has that power, okay? It's just they have basically changed their tactics in order to bring about the theater that will pollute people's minds into wanting the pendulum to swing the other way. And I think after I'm done with this section, I'm going to include an individual that really explains this perfectly well, about the grandfather clock. Okay, because this really is a very interesting sentence here, because when you look at the papacy, especially during the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages, they were staunch and as a conservative brute force power. After Vatican II, they kind of, keeping with the same decrees and they're, and not changing anything, but they repackaged what they originally believed in a different way. So now they've turned kind of like into a conservative view into more of a liberalism type of view. And when the time is right, they are going to go back to the conservative view of the church, which was in the form of martyrdom, execution, and these types of things. We kind of see that already, hints and pieces, in the aspect of how they use Islam today. Okay, I'm not going to get into that right now, but they're just pawns and puppets in the game. So I'm going to include that video. It's called The Grandfather Clock. And that individual really explains this very well. Probably better than I could. So I'm going to include that after this section. The religion of the Romans was always emphatically a state religion, and every Roman god had something to do, some useful office to perform with distinct rituals and sacrifices related to national life. The calendar was an official almanac of religion, which paralleled the seasonal changes of the year, distributing their appropriate ceremonies. Each stage of the year, the progress of agricultural development, the family meal, all contributed to the ongoing pulsation and energetic cycle of ceremonies. About 1 day in 4 was set apart for the worship of particular gods, celebrated by their feasts, games, sacrifices, and ceremonies. Again, this is talking about pagan Rome here. Religion had ceremonies for every event in life, from birth to infancy, puberty, marriage, to death, and a place in every vocation and in every public work. So strongly had these ceremonies and calendar dates become a part of the lives of the people that its influence is even felt in modern society today. Another area of the Roman religion that was most important for the constant surveillance of the well-being of the land and its people was a group of men called augurs and haruspices. I can't even pronounce this one. Haruspices, whose technical expertise was to divine the future. Augurs were a religious college of diviners, and their function was to determine, reveal, and interpret the will of the gods toward men, and was practical in accordance with superstitious occurrences and observations of certain signs or omens. These included thunder and lightning, the flight and cries of particular birds, feeding of the sacred chickens, the action of certain serpents, or accidents such as spilling salt or the stumbling of a horse. It is interesting to note that in ancient Rome there was a territory called Ager Vaticanus, from which site arose the Vatican of today. The word Vatican is a two-part word: Vatic, meaning to divine, and can, or canny, an attribute of the serpent. In other words, Vatican means the divining serpent. So here we already see the aspect of the serpent being divine. Whereas the Bible talks about the serpent, the dragon, Satan, and the devil, Lucifer, as being evil. Here we see, even in the phrase Vatican itself, it means divining serpent, which is literally acknowledging Satan's mind of wanting to become like God. Just like as it states in Revelation that Satan gave the beast its seat and power and great authority. Haruspices had distinctly another science to foretell the future. After certain animals had been sacrificed, their entrails and liver were examined to discover the will of the gods. Nothing in regards to state action was ever undertaken without the advice of these diviners. Jupiter was the supreme deity of the Romans, with the god of Mars and Saturn following. But as Rome ever enlarged her empire, deities of conquered nations were added to her pantheon. For example, there was Mithra, the Persian sun god, Isis and Osiris, divinities of Egyptian sun worship. So these deities actually were taken in by the Roman Empire. Venus, the Semitic goddess of love and beauty, and Janus, the Asian Minor god of doors and hinges, called the opener and shutter, who along with the goddess Cybele, each having a spiritual key, are just a few that became a panorama of pagan gods and goddess devoutly and rigidly worshipped in Rome. In the minds of worshippers, the heavenly or spiritual was always represented or acted out by an earthly. As the sun in the heavens was the great object of worship, no fire was worshipped as its earthly representative. In Egypt, one of the commonest symbols of the sun or sun god was a disc with a serpent around it. The original reason of that identification was as the sun was the great enlightener of the physical world, so the serpent was held to have been the great enlightener of the spiritual, by giving mankind the knowledge of good and evil. Does that ring a bell? In pagan Rome, this fire worship and serpent worship both occupied a preeminent place in Roman esteem. The fire of Vesta, the virgin goddess of the blazing hearth, was regarded as one of the grand safeguards of the empire, by whose duty it was kept with the most jealous care by the Vestal virgins. Small girls, chosen and having to serve chastely for 30 years, the serpent being universally acknowledged as a symbol of fire worship, so the great fiery serpent, or red dragon, then became next to the eagle, the principal imperial standard of the Roman legions as an emblem of that system of fire worship, on which the safety of the empire was believed so vitally to hinge. The worship of the sun, the great fire god, who was intimately identified with the serpent, was actually the central object of worship from which every other god and ritual revolved. As the sun made its daily appearance and disappearance in the heavens, creating daylight and darkness, and as the earth made its annual trip around the sun, producing summertime and winter's death, a time to plant and a time to harvest, it was obvious that all life depended on the sun for its light and warmth, for its very existence. Plainly, then, man's anticipations of good and anxieties of bad, his parade of lesser gods, and his calendar that kept him informed were all subject to the moods of the sun. But the sun had also a human representative. Over this massive and complex system, where every minute detail of worship was controlled and regulated, there presided the sovereign pontiff, or Pontifex Maximus, who was worshipped as the great king of the sun, or the sun god incarnate. Again, this is pagan Rome, alright? Under him was the hierarchy of his college of pontiffs, or cardinals. Like a fine-tuned and well-oiled machine, these priests kept this religious system running smoothly. However, it was only when Julius Caesar, who had been previously elected Pontifex Maximus, and then became, as empire, the supreme civil ruler of the Romans, as he combined in himself both as head of the Roman state and head of the Roman religion, that all powers and functions of the true legitimate Babylonian pontiff were supreme vested in him. It was from this God-king mentality, who had demanded worship from his subjects and to whom Christians had refused to bow, that caused them to be brutally put to death. With all the religion that saturated the Roman soul, it failed utterly to soften the severity of their character or weaken their passion for war and bloody sports. Their hard and rigid wills were rarely moved by the cries of agony or the shrieks of the dying. Okay, so basically, in pagan Rome, you have the same title that is attributed to the papacy in Rome today, which was Pontifex Maximus, and he was essentially a god king. This is what the Caesars were, and he was the head of the Roman state and head of the Roman religion. And obviously, when we get into Catholic Rome, you're going to see how none of this has changed, but it was incorporated and it was baptized into a garb of Christianity that really got its start of mixing paganism, Roman paganism, which is Babylonian, in with Christianity. And the unique thing about that is during all of this persecution that was going on in pagan Rome, when Constantine started coming up on the scene and he had that sign that he supposedly received from God, when he saw the sign of the cross and it said, "In this sign conquer," he had this vision, and within this vision, which I believe this book is going to go into, basically what happened afterwards was now all of a sudden the persecution stopped. And now all these Christians are accepted. But as to what cause? See, the Roman religion changed its view. Just like Papal Rome has changed, not really changed its view, just like the pagan Rome didn't really change its view, but they just incorporated it and they swung the pendulum the other way to a more liberal mindset, to include even the Christians in political parts of office and these types of things, and since the persecution had stopped. And that was the apostasy. That was the beginning of the falling away. Okay? Much like the same thing with Papal Rome. You had during the 1,260 years of persecution and these types of things, and after the deadly wound, and once the papacy regained its the papal states, and after Vatican II, they basically changed, or not really changed, but kind of came up with a different means of strategy, if you will, to get people to become subject to their view, to their system. So, and then once that change of strategy is no longer needed, then the pendulum will start swinging the other way, and we will go back to persecution, which will be the final persecution right before the coming of Christ. So that's basically how close we are. The Word of God, when properly understood, is a most incredible gift. Who can fathom such a sovereign God having the awesome ability to foresee the future, and then with unselfish love reveal it to his people, so that they may not walk in darkness, but rather light? Scripture had predicted centuries before the event that Rome as a world empire would collapse, and out of her reigns and fragments arise a religio-political power that would labor to bind up her broken pieces, the ruling society, benefiting from Rome's successors and conquest, had become extremely rich and prosperous, giving way to excessive licentiousness and debauchery. Over half of the Roman population were slaves, and it was from the miseries of these wretched peoples that the aristocrats relished their fondest pleasures and recreation. The moral decay and depravity of the Roman mind and government is vividly illustrated in its lawfulness of the Wow. Let me redo this sentence. The moral decay and depravity of the Roman mind and government is vividly illustrated in its lawfulness of the gory gladiator contests that excited hundreds of thousands in its amphitheaters. This organization of murder, which became such a popular pastime and sport, and yet being the most monstrous and disgusting outrage upon human dignity, only serves to demonstrate again Rome, the beast, and Rome, not overnight, but as her moral cancer worked incessantly through the centuries from within and without, finally crumbled. The Roman Empire staggers, sprawls, is thrust off the stage, and as if by magic reappears. It is the Church of Rome which plays the part of the magician and keeps this corpse alive. This is going to include section 1 of chapter 3. And as I stated, I'm going to include a 13-minute video clip of an individual who did a really good explanation of how the two dynamics work as a grandfather clock. Okay. By the way, his name is Tom Fress, and this was out of his reading of the book, The Global Vatican. I might not agree with every single one of his views, but he definitely did a wonderful job in this segment, and I want to share that with you to basically explain, because how John Daniel put it, that even though the church seemed to lose all its power to execute people for not adhering to their dogmas and doctrines, she didn't really lose it. She basically covered it up and did a little flip-flop of strategy. Okay. I think one of these days I'm going to get into the connection between the Jesuit order and the book Sun Tzu, The Art of War, because that is another perfect example of this. Okay. How you go from a literal physical attacking of people to more of attacking the mind and causing spiritual decay within the mind by submitting to what Revelation calls the beast out of the sea. So, thank you for listening. Truth be told, truth be known. Stay safe. God bless. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Don't be misled. The Pope is working both sides of the line. He also exchanged letters with Abraham Lincoln. Don't let anybody confuse you. Whether you are a proponent of the North, a defender of the North, whether you're a proponent and defender of the South and their right to secede from the Union, it's the Pope and the Jesuits who fomented that divide and conquer strategy so that the Pope could be the gainer in the end. Okay? If you get involved in the South was right or the North was right, you've completely eliminated yourself from any ability to know the truth. Okay? Just exactly the same way as if you start, if you make all of your consideration in favor of liberalism or the Democratic Party, or likewise, you take your position in favor of the Republicans, the conservatives, you eliminate yourself from any rightful understanding of what's going on. The papacy controls both sides of every conflict. I tried to explain in a brief explanation of what role the Democratic and the Republican parties serve. Those two parties just serve the dynamic, the energy needed to advance new ideas, and whether they be leftist or liberal or democratic ideals, or conservative, traditional Republican ideals, they both serve the papacy. It's like, I've often described it this way. You have a grandfather clock. Guess who the grandfather represents? Okay, I just take it from me. It's called a grandfather clock for a reason. Okay, it's got a pendulum. The clock doesn't advance unless the pendulum is swinging, right? It's got to go left, then it's got to go right. Then left, then right. And if it doesn't go left and right, the hand of the clock doesn't move. You see? Progress demands a dynamo to move it. So first the government of the United States is Democratic, then it's Republican, then it's Democratic, then it's Republican, and every swing of the pendulum, left or right, guess what? It advances the hands on the grandfather clock the same direction all the time. Now are you beginning to get it? Take your side with the South or take your side with the North and argue and bicker and fight, and you will never understand the purpose of the Civil War. The purpose of the Civil War was to energize a dynamic of change. Okay? America still threatened the papacy to become a Protestant nation. It had to be divided and it had to be conquered. And every swing of the pendulum had to benefit the papacy. And it did. Out of the Civil War came new amendments to the Constitution. We were under the impression, of course, they never tell us the real objective of the wars. We were told in the history classes that the objective was to free the slaves. Emancipation Proclamation, remember? But what they got, under the guise of liberating the slaves, we got amendments to the Constitution that enslaved us all. And what does the papacy say? It is necessary for salvation that every human person be subject to the Roman pontiff. To be a slave to the Roman pontiff. And how are we enslaved to the Roman pontiff? By being enslaved to our government, which is the servant of the papacy. The woman rides the beast. Remember, the woman represents the Roman Catholic Church. The beasts represent the governments of the world that carry her. She can't go anywhere if it weren't for the beast. She controls the beast. The beast carries her and does her bidding and tramples God's people under its feet. That's the whole history of Roman Catholicism. The Old World Order and the New World Order alike. There's nothing new at all about the New World Order. It's simply the reestablishment of the Old World Order on a global scale. Now that Protestantism has been destroyed, there's no opposition, no protest from Protestants. They think the Pope is a Christian man, and now they're conquering the rest of the world for the Pope. That's why your taxes are so high. It's necessary for salvation that every human person be slaved by the Pope, the Vicar of Christ, the Antichrist. Makes perfect sense. And if you're one of those pitiful people who I dearly love, who make a career out of defending both the South or the North, either the South or the North, you've defeated yourself. Just like you defeat yourself if you support the Democrats or you support the Republicans. You're just supporting the dynamic that swings back and forth, that advances the hands of Father Time. The Father Time in Rome, whose time is about to run out. Now I'm condemned for this teaching by both the left and the right, because they're loyal to the South, or they're loyal to the North and the Union. See? Nobody will let go of their prejudices to understand the deep-rooted nucleus of the Revolutionary and the Civil War. It was all designed to help the papacy. The Pope doesn't care if you fight for the North. The Pope doesn't care if you fight for the South, as long as you fight. and advance the papal clock. The Pope doesn't care if you vote Democratic. The Pope doesn't care if you vote Republican. He controls both sides of the agenda because they're both his agenda. And when the Democrats win, the Pope wins. When the Republicans win, the Pope wins. So let's stop bickering about Democratic politics and Republican politics and start pointing the finger at Father Time. It's not that difficult to see this. It's not rocket science. We've got to give up our indoctrination. We've been deceived. And doesn't the Bible say he deceives the whole world? Now you know how you've been deceived, you who think you are not deceived. He deceives the whole world. You got to ask yourself, why aren't these truths told in your public schools? Because they're federally funded. They're federally controlled. The federal government writes the syllabus. Why aren't you taught these things in your churches? Because they're all seminarians. They think they have to have a license to do that which is lawful, to preach the gospel. So they go off to a seminary where they're inseminated with a whole bunch of nonsense, and they come back and they leave out the best parts of God's book. And they don't even touch history. Very convenient for the papacy. Very convenient for the man of sin, the son of perdition. Go get you a real pastor. One who knows who the Antichrist is not ashamed or afraid to proclaim it and to identify him. If your pastor doesn't know who the Antichrist is, do you realize he's not qualified to be your shepherd? He's not qualified to stand behind that pulpit. He needs to sit in the back. And it's up to you to put him there. It's up to you to put him there. And to put a man of God behind the pulpit. A Protestant man who will tell you the whole story. The history and the scriptures make perfect sense when you put them together. That's what the Protestants did. They don't do it anymore. They no longer protest. All right. So much for my animated dissertation this morning. I hope I've made sense. You know, if you're offended by me, if you're offended by my manner of speaking, maybe you should go elsewhere. Maybe you should go listen to someone like Joel Osteen. Sugar-tongued devil. Wouldn't tell you the truth if he had a mouth full of it. I'm not milquetoast. I'm not a pretty boy. I'm not a papist. The truth, the ugly truth, can't be sugar-coated if you want to get through the hard skins of indoctrinated people. It has to cut through the delirium. It has got to cut through the indoctrination, the mind control, the curse that has been put upon God's people by the most respected institutions in our country. The government, the schools, and the pulpits of the churches. That's where it comes from. Look, if you're Satan and you want to deceive God's people, you want to control God's people, you want to be like the Most High and cause God's people to do that which God abhors, where would you start? Where would you ultimately like to have the most influence? The government and the churches. And they're his playground. Why, Tom, you're speaking against God's men, God's servants, God's shepherds, the pastors. You see, there's that thick skin again. Well, my pastor loves Jesus. Yeah, so does the Pope. Just ask him. why aren't they telling you the things that I'm telling you? Chances are if they ever knew this stuff, they'd find a more romantic or a more palatable or a more sugar-coated way of saying it, but I dare say he wouldn't reach many of you. What would it take? Weeping? I've even tried that on Inquisition Update, and I was called a ball baby. Sometimes my heart breaks before the Lord. My Savior and my King. Would to God that more hearts would break before the Lord. Okay. So here we have proof that the Pope wrote a letter to Jefferson Davis. Well, he also wrote a letter to Abraham Lincoln. They worked both sides of the conflict, true to their Jesuit oath. Remember, Pope Pius IX was Jesuit trained. He was Jesuit controlled. He was paying the price for Pope Clement XIV's suppression of the Jesuits. The Jesuits were going to control the papacy lock, stock, and barrel, and this Pope did what his Jesuit training instructed him to do, to coddle both sides, present yourself as a peacemaker while we Jesuits foment that war. And that's exactly what happened.